This is Identity at the Center.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff, how are you?
So bad yourself?
Doing great. You know, I sent you a text message on Friday. I think you ignored it, but it was about this idea of attack paths, identity attack paths, which really is just blown up as like you're looking at your text messages to see if I actually said it. I did, or I sent it to somebody else who resembles you. And I said, this is a topic we need to dive into in the podcast. And lo and behold, we've got a guest today who's going to help us understand attack paths, identity attack paths, whatever you want to call them. It's a hot topic.
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, I think identity has taken on so many new forms now. It used to be humans, now we got non-humans, and AKA Agentic, and a bunch of other stuff that's been going on. So sure, why not? That's what we're supposed to be doing, right? Identity security, that's kind of like the point. And I don't remember this text either, by the way. So I ignore a lot of your texts. That one I specifically do not remember ignoring.
Okay. So when you ignore them, it's an intentional thing. Got it.
Right. Yeah, that's it. Let's see. Yeah, go ahead.
No, we've got a bunch of conferences. Probably exactly what you were going to say is like we got a bunch of conferences coming up and discount codes galore. I mean, if you haven't thought about going to conferences this summer, I'm not sure if it's too late, but if you haven't booked anything yet, definitely jump on those conference codes.
Yeah, save some money. And that's on the website, idacpodcast.com. Just scroll down. I have the few listed there. I think we've got Identiverse and EIC listed. Let's see, by the time people hear this one, I think it'll be February 23rd. And I might be in New York later that week if my dates are right. I'm trying to remember the dates we have, but I'll be in New York for the Cyber Risk Alliance, the Identiverse, or not Identiverse, but it's like a cybersecurity summit there. And I'm moderating a panel, and then I'm in Chicago the week after that too. So if you're interested in attending New York or Chicago, let me know. I can pass you along a discount code via LinkedIn. So, yeah. So identity security, we're going to talk about it today. We've got our guest. He's been with us before, Simon Moffatt. You probably already know him as the founder and analyst of the Cyber Hut. He's also a fellow IAM podcaster for the Analyst Brief podcasts. And welcome back to the show, Simon.
I don't know if you can hear that. We are actually having a fire alarm. Just as we start the podcast, we are having a fire alarm going off. So I don't know whether that's real or not real. But I guess we'll see how that evolves. But it's great to be back for as long as I can be here for, certainly.
Well, I love the fact that the alarm went off because we are talking identity security, and what better way to make an intro, Simon? I think you planned this.
It was literally as the word security appeared there, it started doing the thing. So let's give it a few seconds and hopefully it might disappear and the security situation may have resolved itself. But it's great to be back and great to be talking about something which I think is hugely important and hugely in vogue as well.
Yeah, so there's a lot going on in the space, and safety is paramount here. So if we detect heat in your area, feel free to drop, but we'll keep going on until either you're charged to a crisp or decide to vacate the premises. Why don't we start with our last conversation? Because you were with us back in episode 347, and you were working on a book. How did that book go? And for people who aren't familiar with that conversation, go back and check it out, but maybe give a quick plug for what the book's about and how it went.
Yeah, absolutely. I might have one here actually. So those are looking in colour. Look at that, stick it on there. So this was my second book actually. So this was IAM 2035. So the idea was trying to look at where's identity heading to 10 years from now, a decade from now, which is a long time in any technology field. Technology is changing hugely with the advent of AI. So a decade seems a long time. And the idea of the book was to really try and not just give some pithy predictions around what may happen, but sort of educate not just identity practitioners, but all of the non-identity world as well. So data, cyber, business owners, application owners, developers, all of these other stakeholders who are now really, really interested in what identity is, where it's been, what problems we have, and obviously what technologies and solutions are going to exist 10 years from now. So that was a release, but yeah, about sort of early part of 2025, which was absolutely super. And as always, these things, they're a long burn. The idea of any book is, my first book was looking at consumer identity, sort of 5 or 6 years ago. And I'm thinking, that was ages ago. People aren't interested in consumer identity. And obviously they are. It's still a huge, huge thing. So books tend to stick around for a long, long time. I'm very, very grateful for people who have bought it, people who are using it and getting in touch and thankfully saying very nice things about it. So it's a labor of love at the time, but it's good to see stuff out there and people using it and people getting in touch and commenting on it, which is great.
So books are kind of like a time capsule, right? Almost kind of like this podcast, and I'm sure the podcast you do with Arthur and David, they will live forever. And people are going to look back on this time and think, "Wow, what Neanderthals these people were when it came to identity and access management." But this is what we're living right now. We can only kind of work around that. I think writing a book is interesting, and maybe you and Jim can share some notes because Jim's working, on one as well. But do you have other books sort of in progress or ideas? Like what's next?
Oh, you always have ideas. I'm writing obviously all the time as an analyst. You're writing reports and articles and sort of shorter form content. I haven't got any immediate plans for a third book. Albeit sort of James Bond, never say never again sort of thing. It's not on the horizon right now, but that's not to say things change. There's sort of 3 or 4 years between book 1 and book 2, so I think you need a little bit of time off. And as I said, in books, they do last a long time, so it's not a case of doing one and you forget it. You sort of like a musician, really. Sort of you do an album, then you have to then sort of tour the album, not maybe metaphorically as a book tour, but you're sort of talking about it and using it in constantly as part of your sort of narrative. So it's still very much fresh in sort of what I'm doing, I guess, day to day. But I don't know, maybe ask me in a year or two's time. I've not got the writing bug just yet to sit and do another sort of big stint book. But you never know. There's plenty of great topics out there to tackle.
So we've referenced the podcast a couple times, the Analyst Brief, and like I said, you do that with our friend David Motti, who's awesome, and typically see him on a conference tour and things like that. Tell us a little bit about the podcast. How's it going, and anything new that we should be looking forward to?
It's great. We love it. It's not as glamorous as Identity at the Centre, of course. You guys have got that mantle, but no, we do love it. I think it's we try and tackle. There's so much happening, I think, in identity, and by that, we're looking at things like mergers, acquisitions, who may be acquired next, new topics emerging like agentic, and we literally recorded a podcast yesterday, looking at a couple of acquisitions that had happened in the identity resilience space. That's a new area which has emerged the last 2 or 3 years. So we are trying to look at those sort of contemporary events and acquisitions and the vendor sort of changes that are constantly happening there. So that's sort of where we're sitting. We try and do it 2, 3, 4 times a month. So it is good fun. We do meander in lots of directions, mainly because there's so much happening. We do try and cover as much of that as we can.
Yeah, you guys are also both big thinkers, which I think kind of contributes to it. We could talk about one topic all day for sure, but kind of shifting into a lot of what you're working on now. I think at the root level of what I see is that you're talking about how identity has shifted from more or less a back office function to a strategic priority. I'd like you to kind of expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, 100%. And again, it's like one of these sort of 15-year overnight successes. I think there's been a perfect storm of change around identity. I think if you go back maybe 10, 15 years, you have the sort of the technical change of cloud, which I think altered entirely how identity was delivered, how it was integrated, how it was measured, and how it was really used from that perspective. But then simultaneously, we had things like zero trust. Again, zero trust being around for a long, long time, yet organizations are still trying to get there. So you have the sort of network change, and it's a technical change, it's a budget change, how people develop and buy networks. You don't necessarily have offices anymore and routers. You have more of a software-defined view to that. Endpoint security's changed, data security's changed, and all of those technical pillars are hugely reliant upon identity being successful and identity being available, identity integrating effectively. So suddenly it's gone from being the LDAP guy in the corner, and I was that LDAP guy doing the Vel 25 years ago, and nobody cared about that stuff really unless it was not working effectively. And then nobody can log in. Where's the LDAP guy? Get this fixed. Whereas now it's actually, well, customer identity is really important, and fraud and zero trust. And then we have data security. So there's all of these other areas which are massively reliant on identity being effective. So it suddenly has changed from being tactical and reactionary to being strategic and an enabling technology that helps revenue, it helps productivity, it helps staff gain access to the right things, helps with supply chain. So it just has more tentacles, I guess, to it. And I think that's really exciting for us as guys who all love identity. But I think it brings different responsibilities, different budget, different stakeholders as well, different people involved in what is this identity stuff. Is it working effectively? What can it do for me, essentially? I think that's where that has changed. But I guess to answer your question, it isn't just one single thing. I think there's a set of forces happening which have essentially moved it to being this big sort of Super Bowl halftime singer instead of being just the guy doing a few songs in a pub. It's like this, it's the massive attention on identity now, which is that brings some challenges, I think.
Yeah, I think that you said identity as an enabler, and that to me is at the core of it being strategic. There's also the balance of a lot of companies need to stay compliant, and in some companies, it seems like that's all there is. What do you think the mistake is that they're making?
Again, this is multifaceted. I think it's often back to the case of not really knowing what identity is doing. I think, and that's quite a complicated question to try and unpick. And by that I mean, if you are, say, you're a retail bank, pick something relatively benign, I suppose. How is identity helping and hindering that bank? Is it helping the staff do their job? Is it helping them being productive? Is it helping them sell more retail bank services to customers? So you sort of work out where identity is working and not working. And I think unless you do that, you end up with just these reactionary technical choices and technical investments. The same as used to buy, I don't know, something like databases maybe 25 years ago. You looked for the cheapest one or the one that could store the most, or it was often quite a small technical commodity sale. And I think if identity is sort of seen as just this infrastructure thing that we invest upon and then every 6-8 years we'll redesign, I think that is that sort of legacy mindset, I think, where not really seeing the benefits a successful identity program can develop. You end up being quite reactionary, sort of constantly reacting to cyber threats or reacting to business requirements, or you're not really strategic in what identity is trying to achieve. And I think that can be quite difficult to unpick, I think.
Yeah, this idea of strategic identity, I mean, I think it really jumps off the page when you're talking about customer identity. So, creating an experience that is fully integrated based on the identity and kind of just knows what the person needs to access and kind of pulls it all together. On the back end, the company can kind of see like, what is this identity's full relationship with our organization? I'd like to bounce it back to you. What are some of the other things that strategic identity stand for?
That's a really good concept there, because you're absolutely spot on. Because in that customer world, we were all customers, you see, and that's the quite interesting thing. So we all have opinions around interacting in a shop, buying something, customer service. If you like a product or a experience, you tell your friends. if you don't like it, you also tell your friends. So you're going to be doing the sort of the recommendation sort of thing there. So we're all familiar with customers and consumers and even government services, really. And identity in that ecosystem is quite it's quite transparent if it's working or not working. If you're trying to buy something online and you have that shopping cart experience, but then you're just about to pay and it asks you all this stuff about who you are and your favorite color and your dog and your cat and your address, and it's like, whoa, I just want to buy a pair of shoes or something. So identity in that instance is really transparent, and it's really obvious if it's working or not working, to the end user at least. And I think some of those ideas of transparency, I think, have now been placed into other parts of the sort of tech ecosystem. So you then think as an employee, okay, what's helping and hindering me from a technical perspective to log into my laptop, gain access to the systems I need, work with my colleagues, complete my job? And suddenly, again, you sort of look for that transparency. Where's identity helping or hindering? Is it, oh God, I've got 10 different passwords because I don't have a single sign-on, or maybe you are using passwords, which is terrible, and you should be using passkeys or whatever, MFA. So you start to see that transparency where identity is either frictionless and in the background, or it's suddenly, oh God, I've got to do a big access request form because I can't get access to this whatever SharePoint site which I need to do my job. And I think that the customer world is allowing identity to sort of proliferate to the top. And I think some of those ideas are now applicable in the sort of B2E and sort of supply chain area as well. And that, I think, again, it amplifies and places greater attention on those identity journeys and what they are. Are they helping? Are they hindering? And it puts more light onto what identity can achieve, I think.
So we hear this term thrown a lot, identity security, and I'm curious how you define it. Is it identities? Is it access? Is it behavior? Like, what is it specifically that we are, securing when you hear identity security?
All of that, and more. I think it's a really good question. I think we track about, I think it's about 80 plus vendors who all talk about identity security in some part of their description or a narrative or whatever. And the interesting part being, not all of those vendors are competitive. So that's quite interesting. So it means that either the definition is too broad, or there's some pretty odd marketing stuff going on around what it is and what it's not. And I guess my position would be, if you think about the sort of core pillars of specifically B2E workforce identity, but the sort of 5 or 6 big building blocks that we have is like identity verification, identity provider and sort of strong authentication, IGA, governance and administration, PAM, privileged access, probably some sort of storage directory thing, probably some sort of access control authorization aspect in there as well. And you have these sort of 5 or 6 core pillars, and some of those are more mature than others, but they're often historically quite siloed, quite independent, quite isolated, different vendors, different standards, maybe a lack of standards in some. And organizations often invest in all of these technologies, yet they still get breached. And I think there was probably maybe 4, 5, 6 years ago, there was this trend of, well, we've done MFA and we've got privileged access management. I'm going to pick on the vendors who deliver all this stuff. It isn't necessarily the vendor's fault. And it's like, well, we still get breached, and we've had a data breach. We've had insider threats, or we've had some sort of automated cyber crime or a nation state attack. And when you unpick what those attacks look like, somewhere in there was identity. A credential breach, sessions had been tampered with, access control hadn't been enforced correctly, access permissions, ghost accounts, privileged abuse. So all of the, I guess, attack methodology was centering on identity. And it became quite clear that even if you have these core pillars in place, you need more, you need extra. And I think the identity security thing it's a bit like zero trust in the sense it's not a product. It's a concept and a process, and looking at that in end-to-end view of all of your identity flows, your journeys, customers, employees, NHI, Agentic, all of the different identity types we have, and looking at the identity data side, the runtime and behavior side, and just looking at that holistically across your IGA, across authorization, across PAM, across all of these sort of pillars that you have, and just essentially making sure there are no cracks in between them, which I think is ultimately often the problem. And I think identity security is going to, and they say it's a bit of a change in thinking, definitely changing in investment in extra products, different products, but joining together, I think, some of those what have historically been quite isolated product stacks.
So I think you bring up an interesting point here around products, and having the mere presence of a product for identity security does not provide you a divine shield that absolves you from the risk that's out there. It's things will get through, and just having a product isn't the solution, right? You have to have people, process, and technology, and you have to have layers. And even if you have everything in place, there is still a chance, maybe reduced, but there is still a chance that someone will get through. Is that fair?
100% fair. It's a process. It's a concept. I think look, products help, and you will need to invest in products that can look at runtime behavior monitoring, or can look at improving verification services and account takeover. Absolutely will need software, no question. But I think as well is understanding the importance of identity and thinking about identity more of an end-to-end information flow. And again, the other way to think about this is how would an attacker think about this? They don't care that you've invested in a really top-notch privileged access management system or a nice governance system, and you're highly compliant. They just care, well, I want to go from here to there. I don't really care which identities and accounts I use. I don't care whether there are, whether it belongs to Simon, Jim, Jeff, the admin. I just need to get that data, and I'm going to get to that data irregardless. And I think those sort of more flexible information flow ways of thinking like an attacker is not something identity has been familiar with. The join and move a lever process, it wasn't built for security. It was built for productivity. It was built for automation, built to improve staff getting access to downstream systems. So it wasn't built with that security mindset in play. And I think now, because identity has become more important, more of this enabling tech, it's just absolute natural evolution that the bad guys are just going to target identity, because it's the effort reward ratio is massive. Why target a single database when I can target the directory, and the directory contains whatever 50,000 identities and stuff like this. So I think as identity has become more important by design, it's going to attract adversarial activity, both inside and external adversarial activity. And I think that's where you suddenly start to need those different approaches. And one final thing I'll add is, we do have to explain what it is and how it works. But I think if you look back in time at things like networks, you then have network security. If you look at endpoint management, you then have endpoint security. You look at data and data storage, you then had a huge multi-million-dollar industry for securing Oracle databases and other. So it was all of that tiered database security on top. I think it's this evolution now that we have this identity stuff, which was infrastructure originally. So you need to protect it, and now you have an identity security problem we need to deal with.
So a lot of people may or may not know, Jim, that you and I actually do consulting during the day. And a lot of the stuff that we focus on has been like strategy and sort of assessment. And I'm curious, Simon, what is a clear signal that you see that makes you question an organization's identity posture? Because I certainly have thoughts of this, and Jim, I'm sure you do too as well. But it's like, okay, what's something that like jumps out? Like, oh, okay, we definitely have concerns here.
There are a few. I think there's a few sort of meta ones if you zoom out a little bit. And one's just back to that reactionary angle around identity management, not necessarily IAM, but the management of the identity infrastructure. If it ends up being quite short term, tactical, it's not necessarily in line with and in sync with what the business is trying to achieve. I think is one quite big red flag, because it shows that identity isn't seen either as being valuable or important, or it's not being measured effectively. So people don't really know what identity is doing. And I think that those two are quite sort of meta, quite high level, and not necessarily security centric. But if the business doesn't really know what identity does, it's probably quite unlikely it's going to have the correct levels of protection against it. And then if you then sort of look at the day-to-day management of that identity world, if it is being quite reactionary and quite, it is responding to things in that short term basis, I think that is equally quite a big giveaway. But you want to be looking really at that end to end flow of identity. Where do your identities start? Where are they being stored? How are they being used? What systems do they access? What systems have been integrated to the identity world? So it's a lot of sort of mind mapping, if you like, or planning out what the identity landscape looks like, it is going to be infrastructural components, but also the systems involved and where identity is working and not working. I think being able to just have those types of discussions, they're really good indicators around how identity is seen within the organization and how it's working effectively. And is there a sort of strategic view around protecting it and making it have the level of security it needs?
You brought up attack paths and the attack lifecycle, but you're not going to pull me away because I do want to ask a question about identity security, which is, I think we're starting to design as practitioners our strategic plan, our investments around identity security tools, and we need a way to show the metrics that it's actually making things better. So my question to you is, what should that be? And are there often overlooked areas where we're not showing that ROI?
Yes, unfortunately. I think so. We built something at the site probably about 2 years ago, I guess, called the Identity Security Scorecard. And it's about 50, 60 different sort of data points where we sort of go through, and it's part of its self-assessment. So the organization or whoever the admin can go through and they can fill in some responses there around basically how well do they understand their identity security posture. And this is looking at things around visibility. Do you understand where your identities are located? Can you tell me your high-risk identities? So, first of all, what's a high-risk identity? So there's lots of little nuance in there around visibility, understanding where our identity is located, how are they being used, what systems are being interacted with. Then there's areas around protection. How do you protect your core identity world? And that's looking at all the standard sort of best practices that sort of we guys know around. Strong MFA, least privilege, removal of ghost accounts, all the stuff which is sort of good practice there. But then you start looking at detection. Can you detect malicious behavior, whether it's end users doing bad stuff, whether it's administration, misconfiguration. So you want to try and detect things. Then there's a whole set of areas looking at response. If you do find something which looks unusual, maybe it's a misaligned policy, maybe it's Simon who's authenticated correctly, but I'm certainly doing something strange at 10 o'clock at night on Salesforce or whatever. Can you detect it? And if you can, what can you do about it? Can you change my access? Can you flag and raise a ticket? Can you flag my account? Can you direct me to a honeypot and feed me fake information? So there's all of that nuance around being able to protect stuff. Can you detect anomalies? If you can you respond? And then you have the feedback loop around, okay, you found some bad stuff. Can you change policy? Can you update your security policies and procedures and controls to make sure that those identity vulnerabilities are not going to get exposed again in the future? So I think to answer your question, there's again, it's that broad sort of set of areas to look at. And you're looking at that level of both technical and process understanding. And I think with metrics, it is always good to not use them in a scary way, but use them to identify where risk is in the business. Is it risk in technology? Is it risk around a lack of coverage in visibility? Is it lack of coverage with multi-factor authentication? Is it you have a poor understanding of your non-human identities? So it's sort of trying to understand what you don't know. I think is actually quite an important part of that, and there's no shame in that. I think that's part of that risk analysis process, and it's part of that. Okay, this is what we know. This is the stuff we don't know. That to me is a risk, and then you can obviously go and sort of manage that and do something.
I feel like it's important that we don't end up with this FUD factor, right? I've heard this in the boardroom where it's like, they're afraid of that you're just throwing FUD at them. Like when you talk about things like we're going to talk about in a minute, the attack lifecycle and potential negative outputs that come along with that. How do you avoid it being looked at as just FUD?
Yeah, that's fair. Look, you have to realize that any technology is going to be competing with other technologies around spend and budget, and the data security world and the network world and the identity world, they're all trying to, I guess, take a slice of the AI world, which is now emerging around, oh, well, we can protect that, and the data teams say, oh, we can protect that. So there's always that competition for budget and attention and the strategic technological narrative in there. So you're absolutely spot on about FUD, around the fear factor around, authentication is the biggest problem, or maybe it's post-quantum crypto is the biggest problem, or no, it's cloud's the problem. So there's always going to be that competition. But I think when it comes to identity, I always sort of bring it back into a couple of things. Is, what can identity not allow the business to do today? Where is it stopping the business from doing stuff? And it could be supply chain, it could be staff gaining access to the right systems, being able to share data with the correct people. It could be digital teams being unable to launch mobile applications fast enough, so they're losing competitive positioning in the market. So where's identity not doing the right stuff? And then if you have a strategic change and say, well, if we do zero trust and we do this identity security stuff and we do a bit of B2C external identity, what will that allow the business to achieve? And that's back to that enabling technology. So you start to have like, this is what we're stuck with here, this is what we're limited. But actually, if we do this cool stuff, that allows the business to go on this sort of time progress adoption curve and do different things. Maybe we can sell more. Maybe we can keep our staff happier. Maybe we can make our staff more productive. Maybe we can make our supply chain more efficient. So I think it's really important to try and, again, always get it back to, where's identity working? Where's it a bottleneck? What can we do in the future if it's working effectively? And I think if you get onto that sort of vision, you can then, it becomes self-fulfilling, because you can then enable and tell the business, and they go, oh, wow, we can do that. We can sell more, do more. We can remove all of these inefficiencies. And then suddenly that opens a lot of doors, I think.
I started out talking about identity attack path. You call it identity attack lifecycle. I think they're one and the same. Tell me if they're different, or tell me, what they are. And then also you talk about the importance of stopping an attack in its tracks, right? So maybe just continue on a little bit with that.
Yeah, for sure. So, the identity attack lifecycle is interesting stuff. So I think, back to what we were saying earlier around, as the importance of identity is increased, the bad guys know that. So that they home in on that, where the effort versus reward ratio is the highest. And the attack, you've got to think of the attack coming from both internal staff, unfortunately, that does happen, insider threat, fraud, so on, as also the external adversary. And that could be anything from the automated sort of script kiddie stuff right the way through to nation state, zero-day exploits and advanced persistent threats and the like. So as soon as identity becomes this target, you need to think about what does that really mean. And if you look at things like micro attack, which is the sort of general cyber way of thinking about that cyber attack life cycle, if you apply that to the identity world, it's exactly very similar sort of construct. It's going to have a start. There's going to be a dwell time. There's going to be some sort of privilege abuse or privilege escalation, multiple different credential thefts or stealings within that particular flow. Then there's going to be some sort of data exfiltration or some sort of execution of something, maybe a ransomware or the stealing of data. And then obviously, hopefully, the bad guys are caught and found and they disappear. Now, historically, that life cycle has often been focused upon logs. Now, the reason I say that is that people, once it's in the logs, ultimately, the stuff has already happened. The bad guys have done their bad stuff. It's in Splunk or whatever, your logging system, syslog, all this carry on. If it's in the logs, the stuff's already happened. And I think we're sort of conditioned to think about stuff post-event, retrospective. The attacks happen, ransomware's happened, we've had a data breach, customer records have been stolen. You're looking at forensics, you're looking at retrospective analysis. So the stuff's happened. How can we find out what happened and maybe change it for next time? Well, we can't live like that all the time. We can't wait till the stuff's happened and then, try and fix it for next time. Attacks are happening all the time, continually. And I think the idea of the life cycle is saying, okay, but where can identity help here? Maybe it's through identity hygiene and best practice of cleaning up permissions, policies, ghost accounts, orphaned accounts, all of this sort of carry on, which is quite preventative. You're trying to prevent something from happening. But obviously that isn't enough. Something's going to get through the net there. So then we start needs looking at runtime and behaviors and the intent of the identity or the account itself. And I guess the idea with the attack lifecycle is trying to say, look, let's try and identify the bad stuff before it gets to the end, before it gets into the logs. And can we do something just before it completes, really? And trying to say, look, with our detection engineering, with our ability to look at runtime, can we find suspicious activity, malicious things, use composite risk scoring and try and find that actually that looks dodgy. So let's do something about it. Let's remove this session entirely or reduce the session lifetime. Maybe if I had read and write access, we'll just give me read access because whatever, maybe on a strange network or a strange device or something. So it is just trying to find those little small triggers of information and then being able to do something about it just before I've sort of ran off with the bag of digital swag and disappeared into the sunset. So I think we're getting there. And by this, I mean, we have so much information now from a digital perspective around networks, devices, behaviors, identities, what I'm trying to access, what I've done in the past, comparing myself to other colleagues and peers and all this sort of stuff. So I think we are building this mindset of being able to try and prevent stuff. That's brilliant. But if we do need to look at the runtime, having the weaponry to say, actually, there's something strange happening, let's respond and hopefully respond before the attack happens. So I think that's maturing, I think, for sure.
What I'm hearing, like, we are building the mindset. Totally agree with that. It feels like there are some, we probably have the data. Question is, do we have the tools that can interpret the data to take action to prevent an attack in its tracks or stop an attack in its tracks? In your view, what are some of the promising tools? I mean, we've talked a lot about like continuous identity, shared signals framework, things like that on the show. I think there's a lot of promise there. It seems like it's more than just one tool to kind of solve this problem holistically, when the approach has got to be that it's multi-pronged. You're looking not only at authentication logs, but you're looking at other things as well. What are your thoughts?
Spot on. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I think the CAEP and risk signaling is a really, really important part of this. I think that's a really good exemplar of saying, first of all, we need non-identity data signals here. It isn't just about the identity world, as important as it is, obviously, but we need to introduce other factors, other data points to this. And it could be configuration management systems to give you visibility of your application world. It could be the ServiceNow or Jira or ticketing systems to give you information about what people are requesting and why and how and what context does that have. Endpoint management systems, threat intelligence systems. So there's lots of different non-identity parts. And I think, to me, it's a little bit like the sort of asymmetric information problem around trying to navigate through a maze in the dark and you're not quite sure which of those rooms are good rooms, bad rooms. You've got a small torch and you're sort of just trying to build a picture of what's happening. And the more information you have, the more intel you have, just the more informed you become. So I think that the CAEP thing is a good example of that. But you're absolutely right in the sense that's just one aspect to it. So apply that concept to your identity data world and start saying, well, okay, I understand about ghost accounts and access permissions, but in honesty, those aren't new concepts. That's stuff that's been around 25 years. Yet organizations still haven't fixed the problem. So how can you help fixing the problem? How can you identify excessive permissions or accounts that aren't being used or miscorrelated accounts? What other data might you need? So again, thinking, okay, how can I expand my sort of data net and look at, instead of looking at permissions that's been assigned, look at maybe the permissions that are being used, or look at HR information coupled with ticketing information, coupled with laptop usage information. So you just start to correlate and pull in different information points. And I think it's just important to broaden those data signals at all parts of that identity lifecycle, from identity verification, authentication, authorization, governance, and obviously that runtime sort of stuff as well. And it's just spreading that concept of saying, look, we need more information to help us become better informed.
Yeah, and it also feels like, organizationally speaking, IAM in the past have been treated more like, an efficiency driver. I mean, yes, there was a security angle to it all along, but it was kind of an administrative feature on, back end administration, who gets access to what. Single sign-on more or less was treated as like just that, single sign-on, not defense against being attacked. And that's what identity security is all about, is you're being attacked, and how do you use identity? So now it becomes a 24/7 operations activity. Can you talk a little bit about how you see that manifesting, and does that mean there are additional stakeholders in the identity world?
Yes, in short, absolutely spot on. It does become more omnipresent, constantly on, and not just from the security side as well. Constantly on because it's going to be constantly changing. So administrative functions need to be constantly on, and by this I mean not just 24/7, but being able to make changes from a whole host of different sources. API, command line, policies code, infrastructure as code. All of that sort of automation needs to be always on as well. I think the security blanket, absolutely, and this brings some interesting challenges, I think, because spot on, the identity wasn't seen as security enabling. It was 9 till 5, join, move, a lever, productivity. But now it has to take on some of the constructs of the security world, namely, can you discover and have visibility of all of your identity stuff? And it's quite interesting when you sort of often speak to CISOs and they go, well, can I just press the discovery button on the identity thing and just tell me where all your identities are? Well, yeah, not really, because we've got directories everywhere. They're not connected. You have different identity providers not connected. You probably have accounts and identities embedded within core systems that are just not even managed entirely. So, it's inherent to things like network technology that you have discovery, and that's how networks work. Routing protocols, open shortest path first, all this sort of stuff. It's all discovery led. Identity is not like that. It was process and structure and waterfall, and it's a different sort of mindset. So you're absolutely right. It is 24/7, and I think it does introduce security operations. It looks at not only responding to security incidents and how you can fix identity as part of that, but obviously, as I was saying earlier, what can we do during the attack? Who's going to be involved in that? It is going to be that security focused layer. And again, security architecture, how can identity help with the confidentiality, integrity, availability sort of triad as well? So different stakeholders, they're all going to have slightly different needs, but I think that's positive. I think it helps identity become more match fit, if you like, more match fit for the modern world, and be more adaptive and responsive and integratable and things like this.
Okay, so let's pivot to the AIatthecenter.com question. We joke an awful lot about AI, and yes, that's a real URL, and yes, it will point you to this podcast. I guess with Agentic AI, right, this has been sort of the hot button thing probably for a while, but I think really sort of in the consciousness of identity for probably the last 6 months or so. What does that mean for identity strategy, identity security, and other similar terms?
Yeah, it's a great one. It's just like this huge nuclear explosion of stuff that's come along and just sort of detonated upon all of our ways of working, our ways of thinking about tech, and certainly security for sure. And I think it's the best way I think I could describe it is we haven't fixed the human stuff really from an identity point of view. And by that I mean we're still plagued with some of the core problems of, I don't know, RBAC, ghost accounts, excess permissions. Nobody does MFA properly and all these sorts of things. And then 3 or 4 years ago, we had the more A bit of a more focus on machine identity, service accounts, looking at sort of APIs and workloads and a bit of privileged access stuff in there as well, and machine-to-machine comms. We haven't really fixed that either, because that's got this big hockey stick curve of numbers and huge issues with the credential rotation, and there's no HR system for workloads and non-human identities. So we've got these two problems which we haven't solved, and then you've got cloud to deal with. And then suddenly someone drops this agentic AI sort of Megatron on everything else. And it's like, wow, okay, it's the worst of both worlds. And by this, I mean, there's a huge scale problem in the sense of agentic AI's, the adoption is going to be huge, 50, 60, 100 times the number of human identities, for example. But then it also has issues around, it isn't deterministic like workloads and basic API to API comms with a nice JSON payload, and it's this big and it works between 9 to 5, and it has a JOT that you use to authenticate, and it's quite predictable in what it does. Whereas the agentic world is actually non-deterministic. It's geared towards optimization. So what it does is actually going to be quite unusual in how it behaves. And often that's quite legitimate because it's there to optimize and improve and learn and everything else. So it's generating requirements that we haven't even solved for human and non-human, and then suddenly we've got to do it for agentic. So there's a whole host of different ways to deal with that. I think absolutely it looks like it's going to get characterized as a different identity type. So it's neither human nor non-human, first of all. I think that's quite a nice concept to consider. And also the other sort of paradigm that's emerging is to treat it like a digital employee. Now that is subtly quite interesting, because maybe you would trust your colleagues with your passkey and your credentials and your Active Directory logins. I personally probably wouldn't. But suddenly we're in this mindset of we're having to sort of trust and give all of our credentials and permissioning and everything else to these agents who perhaps don't have accountability, don't have behavior monitoring, aren't necessarily using strong authentication and just-in-time permissions and all this sort of carry on. So it is a hugely interesting space. And I think one final sort of comment there would be the innovation adoption of AI and agentic AI is absolutely off the scale, whereas the adoption and innovation of identity and security is quite flat still. So we're ending up with this sort of gap between this hockey stick curve adoption of AI and security and identity sort of plowing along, and yeah, it's doing some good stuff and it's improving all the time, but there's this big massive gap, a security gap around, well, how do we do just-in-time permissioning for agents? How do we do strong auth? How do we do process attestation? How do we do confidential computing with these agents who are operating as ephemeral things which come and go within a few seconds? So it generates some huge non-functional and functional challenges, really, which we're not quite there yet. And I think we need to think end to end. It needs a whole host of data security, identity security, and governance to get that stuff right, I think.
So I think I heard you describe that there might be this third type of identity, right? Agentic versus human versus machine. And I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of the problems you described, that I'll call it that identity chaos that happens, right? Yes, you're right? API to API, it's a very predictable transmission and you know what it's doing, but humans don't do that. Humans today are interacting with accounts in any variety of number of ways, standard and non-standard. That's why we have things like conditional access, right? And rules and things like that. Now, I understand the scalability is the big challenge, right? When it comes to agentic identity, but the behaviors of an agentic identity are much more similar to a human identity than they are to a machine identity. So do we really need a third classification to further muddy the waters, which I think is what IAM is really good at, is creating new acronyms for things? If it's truly needed, great, but I'm not sure yet if it really is like a subset of something or if it really is strong enough to stand on its own as a type.
I guess the counterpoint is we're still struggling with solving those human problems, aren't we? I think if we'd solved them and we had a really good sort of mature way of saying, actually, yeah, do you know what? It is just a subset of what we do and it's fine. I think because that isn't the case, it's almost like a cascading problem. So you have a ghost account in the human world multiplied by a long-lived credential in the NHI world. That just cascades into a much bigger thing. And I think the big agentic question mark at the minute is all about accountability and traceability and directing that back to some sort of carbon life form. And I think because we haven't been great at solving these problems for other areas, it's like, do you know what? I think we need to have a really grown-up conversation about how do we manage this, because you're going to need different tools. You're going to need different architectural patterns, because the architectural patterns we've had in the past, even the sort of PDP, PEP, just in time, zero standing privileges, we're not quite there yet, because if we were, a lot of these issues in that attack lifecycle stuff would probably disappear. And I'm an advocate for saying we should. I'm just based on observations around how this sort of industry is heading there. And I think we need some real conversations around who needs to be involved in protecting AI. And it isn't just tech. It's going to be governance. It's going to be ethics. It's going to be legal, data security, and the data science people are going to have a really good point to make in there as well. And I just think there's a lot of unanswered questions currently around what protection angle looks like. And yeah, there's numerous different startups trying to provide some guidance there. So I think it is moving very fast. It's early days though, I think.
What needs to change from an identity standpoint to address the explosion of agentic identity? Because I feel like, we've spent decades trying to solve for humans, but now the problem is that scale, right? For every one human, there are 10, 100, 1,000, 1 million agentic identities that are spawning, and they're spawning their own agents, right, to do things. So what is it that you see over the next maybe like 3 to 5 years where it's like, okay, we really need to think about the way we are addressing identity and access management as a whole to counter that?
I think there are some positives, though. I sort of painted a big gloomy picture. I think there's some huge positives. I think the first one is actually use AI to fix some of those human problems I've been describing. So using AI in a much more focused and condensed way to say, actually, do you know what? Our identity and access management world is good, it's growing, it's incrementally improving, but we could use AI to actually fix a lot of the governance issues, fix a lot of the broken groups in Active Directory that don't have descriptions, fix all of the access requests, access review compliance issues we've had for decades and decades, because nobody does that properly and it's ineffective. And use AI to sort of maybe fix and tighten up that human-centric stuff, make that match fit. I think by doing that actually frees us up as industry experts to say, actually, you know what? Conceptually, we can then start to apply some of this stuff to how we do strong authentication, just in time, runtime policy enforcement for agents. So I think the concepts are there. I think there's definitely a bit of issue around technically what that looks like, which I think in honesty is probably quite an easy thing to fix. But I think currently the big issue is that discovery, visibility, ownership thing. What's happening with AI in my organization? Where's it being used? Why is it being used? What's the value? And then look at doing the sort of security on that. And hopefully, you mentioned 3 or 5 years. I think maybe hopefully 5 years from now, it's a much more proactive thing. And it isn't just a case of sort of wrapping security on stuff afterwards. It's more about adding in those core concepts every time you build an agent or deploy an agent, and it has strong auth, process attestation, trusted work environment. It doesn't have access permissions, or you can identify when it does. So I think the concepts we all know. I think the concepts exist. I think it's just applying them in a slightly different sort of environment, I think.
I mean, when you released your book, I Am in 2035, I was like, this guy's got guts. He's got guts. So I've always kind of had the base premise that identity follows the technology. And I'll give you another premise that I think I'm coming to, which is that we're constantly head faked by what can AI do today? And then there's some assumption that it's going to be a while before it's, but yet that's not what we've experienced. We had the ChatGPT moment, right? And look at where we are now, where it's like, it's blowing it away already. And if the real futurists, which I don't consider myself one, are right, we reach kind of the singularity moment in the near future. Singularity, for people who don't listen to this garbage all the time, it's when the AIs are as smart as the people, right? generally speaking, that's the term. And Jeff's nodding no, so he can correct me, but that was my understanding. Anyway, where I'm getting to with this is, it feels like it shakes the core of what enterprise IT might be 3 to 5 years from now. In fact, it might shake the core of what an enterprise is 3 to 5 years from now, right? We have this assumption that all these thousands of people are going to come to work for a company when the futurists are saying 50% of the white collar workforce is going to be eliminated. And when you think about a lot of enterprise IT applications, let's just call them SaaS, I think I'm oversimplifying. Doesn't really matter what the delivery model is. They're mostly built around people doing a job, right? And if you're talking about agents doing a job, do they need these tools? Do they need an HR system? Do they need a CRM system external to the large language model itself?
To unpick there, Jim, crikey. I think nobody knows where it's heading. I do think that's a little bit scary as well. I think I'm not necessarily saying it's all doom and gloom, but I think the potential is unknown, and I think that in itself is quite a scary thing. I think it will transform. Lots and lots of jobs will change and alter, absolutely. But I do think there's also that more fundamental change and shift around how we do business, how we work, how we interact with people, how we do things. I'm not quite sure anybody knows what that quite looks like yet, but I think a lot of it is going to be based on trust. Can you trust this thing, whatever it may be, to be a friend, do something, act on your behalf? Maybe you're interacting with it or with this whatever combined set of agents. And then trust is a huge part of that. And to get trust to work, you need to have identity in there, both physical and digital identity for that to work. So I think identity has a real fundamental part to play, irregardless of what that looks like. I don't think it's going to look like the identity of right now with the stuff we have. But I think the concepts, the physical concepts that we have as people, how we interact with each other, how we trust each other, how we respect and listen and interact, somehow you'd have to try and translate that to the digital world. And I have no idea what that looks like. I mean, it sounds a little bit scary, but I think it is coming very rapidly.
I think that's probably the only thing we can predict, that it's coming quickly, too quickly, and we probably won't be fully prepared, and we'll have to do what humans always do, and that's adapt and figure it out.
I mean, I'm always an eternal optimist. I don't think it'll end up in sort of robot wars. But one thing I will add actually is that maybe AI is the only thing that can secure AI. If you think about where that singularity goes to and the way you design and define systems, it maybe isn't a human that has to be able to do that. It may be an AI system is the only thing which can operate on the same frequency, I guess, to be able to protect that. So that'd be my prediction if I was going to ever write another book. Identity at 2055, if we're all here then, who knows?
Well, it worked for the Matrix, so I'm sure it'll work, for real life. So we're all good with that. I always learn so much, Simon, when we talk. And, I want to wrap up this conversation with maybe learning a little bit more on the conference side of things, because Jim and I are headed to EIC in Berlin in May. And then we've got another conference in Las Vegas with Identiverse. And last year was my first time going to Berlin and really enjoyed it. And I hit Amsterdam after that, really enjoyed that as well. And I'm curious if you have any tips for Jim and I, our second time going to Berlin, and maybe parts unknown throughout EU. What should we be thinking about as we head out this summer?
Enjoy it. Europe is fabulous. Europe is... It's very small in some respects, and by that I mean within sort of 2 hours you can have a multitude of different cultural experiences, languages, food, drink, and other. And I think that is just the absolute beauty of living in Europe. I live in the UK, obviously, but Europe is a real big part of my view and vision of the world. And it's multiple things. I would take every opportunity that you can and sample all of that culture. It is fabulous history of Europe. I think it's good. In Germany, Berlin, there's some great bars in Berlin. There's some good bars in Berlin. I'm sure we can do that offline. But embrace it all. It's brilliant.
Well, give me something specific. Like, what's a hidden gem that you want to promote or let people be aware of? Like, hey, this place is great, and maybe not a lot of people know about it. I mean, we have people all over the world who listen, and maybe they're familiar with it, or maybe they're getting ideas for like, oh, next time I'm in that area, Simon said we got to go here.
I'm not going to be EIC. I hasten to add this year. So I guess if it is it in Berlin this year?
It's in Berlin.
A German Keller beer or a wheat beer will be my go and hunt out a really good Weiss beer in a German cellar bar. So it's got to be an underground bar. It can't be on pavement level. Underground. I'm not going to give a particular name, but there are some that exist and they'll have little candles on the tables, and they'll be very small, and they'll be open from about 5 p.m. onwards in the afternoon, and they're the best places. They're the best ones. German Weiss beer in an underground bar with a bit of old-fashioned techno music going on the speakers. That to me would be. You'll probably find me somewhere a shady little bar like that. That'll be my end of conference day. I think that'd be my tip.
Sounds a little bit similar to a place that I went. So shout out to John and Matthias, who I went out with, and it was a bar, pub type place underneath the train tracks.
Right.
And, we had wheat beers. Weiss is typically if I'm going to drink a beer, typically it's going to be like a Weiss, something like that. And then pretzel and sausages, and just kind of sat in this pub and just hung out and relaxed. And it was great.
Was it an underground pub?
It wasn't underground, but it was directly underneath the train tracks in Alexanderplatz kind of area. I don't remember the name of it, but it was a similar type vibe, not directly underground, obviously, but
that's good. It is close. That's a good starting point. Yeah.
Okay, so that's like the newbie version of that.
To progress to the underground, and then you would have ticked all of the.
I think if you drink too much, you might progress too far underground, and then you got a different problem.
That's tomorrow's problem, though.
Jim, do you want anything to weigh on here?
I mean, I would just say that I'm thinking about our trip to Europe, and I'm thinking the culture and the lifestyle. I mean, they've got it in spades. I think our trip to Vegas is going to be very different. Vegas and the Berlin scene are very different, but I enjoy them both.
I find Vegas relaxing, and I don't know if that's because I'm weird or something else.
I like the people watching. I've given up a lot of the vices that make Vegas a problem for most people. Don't gamble. But it is a good time, but it's super expensive there. Yeah, I'm probably going to try to make it to the Sphere again. They've got Wizard of Oz playing, which might sound a little bit nerdy, but I'm looking forward to it.
At the Sphere, I mean, you can see anything. You can watch paint dry at the Sphere, and I'm sure it'll be interesting.
Would make it, yeah.
All right, let's go ahead and wrap it up there for this episode. Simon, thank you so much for joining us. As always, it's a pleasure. We'll have links in our show notes for people to check out. So we'll have a link to you in LinkedIn, so people can reach out with either recommendations for underground bars or, AI, tomfoolery, or whatever it may be, how we want to work through that. I'll have a link to the Analyst Brief podcast as well in our show notes. People can check that out so that you and David continue to do a great job with that one. And yeah, we'll have links to us as well. So reach out to Jim and I. We're always looking for ideas for shows and questions, comments, concerns, and all that good stuff. So idacpodcast.com. Don't forget our discount codes. And yeah, that's it. So we'll leave it there. Thanks everyone for watching and or listening, and we'll talk with y'all in the next one.
Guys, thank you. See you soon.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com. See you next time on Identity at the Center.